Right. Thank you, Iris. I really appreciate the invitation. And it's especially exciting to present alongside Oren. We've known each other a really long time, and our work has kind of complemented each other also. So it's just really nice to get to do this with you. I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you'll be able to see everything. Let's see. And probably someone should tell me whether you can see it or not.
We can see it.
Yeah? Great.
We can see also the, oh yeah, now it's good.
Excellent. So I prepared a rather more formal talk than maybe was necessary for the seminar context, but now that we're on Zoom, hopefully it will be an entertaining lecture also. If you need to move me around to see the text, go ahead. So, Bialik, as you're probably aware, once remarked that reading the Bible in translation is like kissing a bride through her veil. Mediation, apparently, is the death of intimacy. At the same time, it's strange that Bialik imagined the Tanakh this way, as a barefaced bride, because biblical exegesis, ancient and modern, has typically understood the Hebrew text itself as veiled, what Robert Alter has dubbed the Bible's art of reticence. In this view, much of the psychological action of biblical narrative goes unseen, submerged in characters' pregnant silences and conspicuous absences. Shmuel Buch, about which I'll speak today, is probably the best known of the so-called Yiddish biblical epics, dating roughly to the late Middle Ages and early modern period. It is, in essence, a retelling of 1st and 2nd Samuel as a high medieval chivalric romance. And while it follows the David story closely, almost verse by verse in many places, it's difficult to call Shmuel Buch a translation. Beyond the demands of rhyme and meter, it's full of eye-catching embellishment. Single lines in the Tanakh are unfurled into type scenes of chivalric romance. Star-crossed lovers parting, knights hurling taunts across the field of battle, and so on. So it's tempting, therefore, to imagine Shmuel Buch as a flagrant bastardization of the biblical text, taking outrageous liberties in rewriting scripture as a page-turner. Today, though, I'd like to ask whether Shmuel Buch, in its attunement to the subtext of biblical narrative, is not in fact a more faithful rendition than appearances would first suggest. And central to this line of inquiry is the idea that Shmuel Buch's fidelity to its source materials, both biblical and rabbinic, is not only linguistic or thematic, not only about the content, but also structural. By which I mean that when Shmuel Buch goes about adapting biblical narrative to chivalric epic, it limits itself to those editorial operations already attested in Jewish biblical exegesis. These operations are legitimized by rabbinic precedent, and for this reason, I think it's somewhat inapt to describe them as liberties taken with the biblical text. They are more often methods of reorganization the rabbis have already historically used at their discretion to adapt biblical narrative to novel textual formats, not in order to alter or distort its meaning, but to make that meaning more variously textually accessible. Far from Bialik's obscuring veil, then, exegetical translations most often endeavor to lay bare implications which biblical narrative leaves unexpressed. And in this sense, we can think of commentary as a machine for processing subtext into text. Striving for ever greater clarity, then, Shmuel Buch turns to the rabbis to resolve the linguistic, halachic, and narrative uncertainties that appear in the Masoretic text. And it often points up the emotional stakes of the story by using enhancing rabbinic narrative, which is to say midrash or agadah. For Shmuel Buch, at least in its earlier iterations, barely acknowledges a distinction between the written and the oral Torah. We get some indications of this, but they're scant. Beyond this reliance on traditional exegesis, however, Shmuel Buch is also an explicator of another kind, and like the Bible, deeply invested in long-range narrative momentum and its eventual emotional impact. Erich Auerbach famously describes the actions of biblical characters as fraught with background. That is to say, psychically charged by what we, the readers, know them to have witnessed, suffered, and survived, even if their inward evolutions are never made explicit in the text itself. The slow gathering sea changes in the psychology of figures like David and Michal are in Shmuelbuch brought to the very surface. If the Bible is emotionally reticent, Shmuelbuch is hyper explicit. No stone left unturned, no sword or heart unbared. This emotional nakedness bespeaks Shmuelbuch's fidelity to the deep psychological structures of biblical narrative, which literal translation alone would be hard-pressed to convey. To achieve this subtextual fidelity, Shmuelbuch relies on rabbinic techniques of textual reorganization, and in this sense remains faithful to its exegetical antecedents as well. So to illustrate this effect, we'll take a look today at Shmuelbuch's rendition of the Michal story, one of the Tanakh's most compelling and famous deployments of narrative reticence. So I'll summarize briefly here, and I've thrown up these timelines so you can follow along. The numbers that run along the bottom in gray are verse numbers, right? So verse numbers in the Tanakh and then verse numbers in Shmuelbuch. But at a glance, you can see that they track in terms of narrative pacing very, very closely with one another. So Michal, daughter of King Saul, just to remind all of you, is married to David as a sort of consolation prize after her elder sister Negev, who had been betrothed to him, is given to another. The text notes that Michal loved David, but we hear nothing of his feelings for her. Saul names as her bride price 100 Philistine foreskins, hoping that David will be killed in the attempt, but he succeeds and the two are eventually married. When Saul, seized with growing paranoia about David's rise at court, tries to kill him, Michal orchestrates his narrow escape, though again, she receives only silence from David in return. Now on the run, David takes several other wives, and Saul unceremoniously gives Michal to another man, one Palti ben Laish, also called Paltiel. After Saul's death, David demands Michal's return as a condition of negotiations, emphasizing the high bride price he paid for her. Palti follows her weeping until he is turned back. We hear nothing of David and Michal's reunion, but sometime later, she watches as he dances barely clothed, leading the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. And with disdain and apparent jealousy, she rebukes him for his immodesty. He responds to this rebuke with an excoriating speech, reminding her of the downfall of her father's house and his own divine election. Without making explicit any connection, the narrator then informs us that Michal had no children until the day of her death. 400 verses after that, after Michal's last appearance, David hands over 5 men, described as the sons of Michal, to the Gibeonites for execution. So this plot arc has long been considered a masterpiece of narrative reticence because, as Robert Alter has pointed out, it entirely withholds from us David's side of the marriage. He in fact addresses no word to Michal other than the scathing retort that marks the end of their shared story. And what we know to have been her early love for him seems to have gradually soured into jealousy, bitterness, and even contempt. And while we hear nothing of her feelings for this second husband, Palti ben Laish, we know she is taken from him through no will or agency of her own, and that he, for his part, followed her with lamentation many miles before they were separated. For Shmuelbuch, naturally, the Michal story is shot through with epic pathos, or at least the potential for it, in which it discerns a love triangle familiar from other chivalric romances. We could think of Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, or Tristan, Isolde, and King Mark. The biblical David's enigmatic silences become in Shmuelbuch opportunities for effusive emotion. He declares his love for Michal openly. He admires her beauty and her virtue. Before fleeing Saul's wrath, the two perform an impassioned duet of leave-taking, wondering when, if ever, they will be reunited. After Saul's death, David demands Michal's return not on the grounds of the 100 Philistine foreskins by which he won her, but by poignantly recalling how she saved him from certain death. Palti, meanwhile, Shmuelbuch spotlights, through added dialogue and carefully placed midrashic interpolations, as a paragon of courtly love, dutiful in service of his king, chaste in his desire, but unfailingly faithful in his love. Upon closer examination, however, this chivalric transformation is achieved through the same kind of textual restructuring employed by Shmuelbuch's immediate rabbinic antecedents. It thus offers us a telling demonstration of how Shmuelbuch constructs its outward chivalric form through the internal application of rabbinic textual methods, or freedoms. We find biblical reticence at its height in the giving of Michal to Palti. And Saul gave Michal his daughter, David's wife, to Palti the son of Laish, who was of Galim. This is naturally a charged moment for naive reader and learned explicator alike. Why does Saul only now use Michal against the fugitive David, who was well within his rights to take more wives? How did Michal, who we know loved him, react to the dissolution of their union? And who is this Palti to whom she's been so abruptly given? This moment raises similarly urgent halachic questions, of course. Were Saul's actions legal? Was the marriage to Palti consummated? If so, what is now Michal's status? An adulterous woman, a victim of rape? And it's only much later, nearly 200 verses later, that the biblical text offers us any insight. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, even from Paltiel the son of Laish. And her husband went with her, weeping as he went, and followed her to Bahurim. Then said Avner unto him, go, return. And he returned. Here, Palti is twice named Michal's husband, and in addition to his weeping, follows her from Galim to Bahurim, that is almost to the doorstep of David's stronghold in Hebron, turning away only when commanded to do so. Two of Shmuelbuch's primary exegetical sources, Rashi and the medieval Midrashic compendium Yalkut Shimoni, adopt very different textual strategies for resolving the halachic question raised by Michal's bigamy, as you can see in the following table. So if you take a look at it, it's a bit of a cheap trick on my part, but these gaps illustrate an important point. Both exegetical sources enjoy a great deal of discretion about when to disclose pertinent midrashic information and with what degree of detail. And this freedom, this discretion, is often exercised in service of very, very practical textual purposes. It is in service of the reader and the reader's use of the text. So the Alcott is basically designed as an encyclopedic database for Agadot, and it uses the linearity of biblical narrative as a finding aid, as its index. In the example above, we find ourselves reading what is in effect the encyclopedia entry on Palti ben Laish. It's like an information dump, prompted as though automatically by his first sequential appearance in the biblical text. Quote, and why was he called Paltiel? Because God saved him from sin. It is taught that he thrust a sword between Michal and himself and said, let any who engages in this deed be pierced by this sword. And by went and wept after her, for the commandment he would no longer be able to fulfill of resisting sin. So for ease of reading, I've only given you about a sixth of the Yalkut's entry on Palti that appears in this place. In its entirety, it scrolls through virtually every pertinent piece of rabbinic commentary on him, pointing forward and backward in time, both within the David story and to texts outside it. That is, cross-referencing many disparate moments in the biblical and rabbinic corpora. Given this comprehensive initial treatment at 1 Samuel 25, the Yalkut then has no need to comment on later appearances, as in 2 Samuel 3 below. At which point we can turn to Rashi. Rashi, by contrast, has a very different project, and he's concerned mostly with establishing the pshat. His textual choices revolve around clarifying local, often linguistic ambiguities in individual verses. And to this purpose, he filters out everything in the exegetical corpus that doesn't make clearer the immediate literal meaning of a particular verse. So this account of Michal's abrupt marriage to Palti in 1 Samuel 25, however fraught with background, however politically and personally enigmatic, however legally or morally troubling, is linguistically at least unambiguous. And so Rashi feels no need to clarify. It is only much later, at Palti and Michal's parting, that Rashi apprises us of information the Yalkut provided at the beginning. Went and wept after her, that is, 2 Samuel 3:15, for the commandment which was leaving him. For all those years he had thrust a sword between himself and her in the bed, and did not sin with her. So because Michal is here on the cusp of resuming her sexual relationship with David, Rashi now has urgent reasons to clarify the halachic ambiguity. And it may also be that he's hedging against another interpretation of Palti's weeping, namely that this excess of emotion is meant to imply a sexual consummation. Rashi carefully attends to the narrative's linear timeline, but not necessarily its emotional contours. And he's thus keen to dispel any suspicion only before Michal rendezvous with David in Hebron. So Rashi gives us this post hoc exculpation, and the Alcott an ad hoc assemblage. Shmuel, however, exercises this same exegetical discretion in service of longer emotional arcs, those already latent in biblical narrative itself. And it accomplishes this by planting evidence, midrashic evidence, whose ultimate significance will only become apparent much later on, and to tragic effect. So here is Shmuel's rendering of the scene of remarriage. Saul gave Michal to Palti, son of Laish. He said, I will give her to you, but you shall do nothing to her. I do this only to grieve that villain David. Take her for your wife, and he will part with her. Now Palti had to do as the king desired. Between Michal and himself, he laid a naked sword. Shmuel inserts the midrash of the naked sword exactly where it belongs in the narrative sequence. That is, after the finalization of marriage negotiations and ideally just prior to the moment of consummation. We should also note that these are no negotiations of bride price as they were with David. Here, Saul commands and Palti obeys, a fact which casts his abstinence in a new light. Not only a fulfillment of a spiritual commandment to resist temptation, Palti's conduct now accords with royal decree. The naked sword shows us how Palti both masters his inner passions, as the rabbis would like, and exemplifies a courtly ethos of personal honor and feudal submission. Palti emerges as heroic then, by Shmuel's manipulations, as heroic in both rabbinic and chivalric senses. Shmuel uses this first impression of Palti to seed evidence of this character's immense capacity for honor-bound self-sacrifice. And it does so long in advance, so that later the tragic potential of Palti's virtues will be fully activated. Then King Ishbosheth sent word to Palti, son of Laish, send me David's wife. Take care and make haste. The messengers went at once to Palti, and he sent her to Sir David in his own country. Sir Palti had had her a great many years, and I tell you truly, he went along with her and wept. Then the noble Avner said, Palti, go home. Sir Palti took his leave and left her with him alone. In an act of wrenching obedience to yet another king, who leaves him once again no room for dissent or resistance, Palti grieves for the loss of Michal, whom Ishbosheth callously calls the wife of David, effectively erasing any bond between them. And unlike its biblical counterpart, Shmuel reminds us explicitly how much time has elapsed since Palti and Michal were thrown together. This detail of timing and of pacing makes us see all the more vividly the courtly character of Palti's love, true, chaste, and yet enduring. At the same time, Palti's unhesitating submission, first to Saul, then to Ishbosheth, then to Avner, reaffirms our impression of him, a man whose exemplary sense of feudal duty overrules all other impulses. It is doubtless no accident that, before his total erasure from the narrative, this man that the Bible twice called Michal's husband is here in Shmuel twice honored with the title Sir Palti. By giving us this midrashic information long in advance, Shmuel generates a powerful composite portrait of a character who occupies a mere 2 verses in Tanakh. Palti assumes the proportions of a stock figure of the chivalric corpus, the loyal vassal whose obedience to his lord and observance of the tenets of courtly love come at the bitter cost of personal happiness. Through its deft restructuring of biblical and rabbinic materials, then, Shmuel perfectly adapts Palti to a foreign chivalric context. Moreover, by reinscribing midrashic episodes within the long-form linearity of biblical narrative, Shmuel raises to the surface those implicit human griefs which biblical reticence had left unspoken. The tragic subtext of the Michal Palti story, however, has not yet been fully exposed. And as before, Shmuel strategically plants midrashic evidence to raise the emotional stakes of the story and amplify their eventual impact. In the biblical version, we see nothing of Michal after Palti's leave-taking. Her long postponed reunion with David is cryptically omitted. Her next appearance, and her last, then occurs when David leads the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem in a triumphant procession, lightly clad in a linen ephod and dancing. Michal rebukes him for exposing himself to his servant slave girls, and he turns around and unflinchingly reminds her that he is God's elected king, and implies he would rather debase himself with slave girls than with her, the daughter of a fallen royal house. Ever dispassionate, the biblical narrator reports that Michal had no children until her dying day. After years of separation then, summoned back as a pawn in a political maneuver apparently devoid of sentiment, and parted from a man grief-stricken by her loss, Michal's storm of moral scorn and thinly veiled sexual jealousy reads as the breaking of some kind of inner dam. Humiliated past bearing, the bride has stripped back her own veil. And in a visitation of punishment so swift as to seem divine, we learn that Michal never even conceives a child to comfort her. This infertility smacks of divine retribution, but it may equally be that David simply followed through on his threat to seek honor with the slave girls, and by implication forsake Michals Bed entirely. So Shmuel in its rendering of this scene, sharpens every emotional detail. But for reasons of time, I'd like to focus on one point in particular. Michal had sinned against her beloved husband, wherefore she bore no child until her death. Once again making explicit what the biblical account had merely implied, Shmuel leaves no question about the moral or perhaps providential meaning of Michal's barrenness. It gives here an unusually close translation of the biblical text, bore no child until her death. But this translation is syntactically embedded within an unambiguous ethical framework. In fact, we receive the homiletical explication, had sinned against, first, and the biblical translation only later. Far from primary text and secondary gloss then, these two clauses appear to make equivalent truth claims. By explicitly naming Michal's childlessness a punishment for sin, however, Shmuel stages one last long-range emotional amplification, which it can once again anchor in the rabbinic tradition. In the biblical text, Michal's barrenness is directly contradicted by that later passage in which the 5 sons of Michal, daughter of Saul, are given over to the Gibeonites for execution. So modern readers understand this complication, Michal and her sons, as a scribal corruption in the Masoretic text where it should have read Merav. But the rabbis resolved this by claiming that these were not in fact Michal's sons, but were indeed Merav's, though Michal adopted them after her sister's death, and they were then named after her. Once again, Rashi and Yalkut Shimoni hew to their distinct exegetical missions in handling this material. The Yalkut incorporates the narrative of Merav's death and the fates of her children into her entry, where it explains her aborted betrothal to David at the very beginning of the David-Michal scenario. And it gives that this is part of a densely coordinated harmonization of classical rabbinic sources. Rashi, again clarifying the pshat, gives us this information only much later with this precise verse, appending it to the execution of the 5 sons as a kind of post hoc rationalization. So because the Tanakh nowhere describes Merav's death, the rabbis simply presume it the most likely reason for Michal's adoption of her sister's sons and the justification for calling them by her name. When precisely this death took place in the narrative and when the adoption occurred as well is just not that interesting to either Yalkut Shimoni or to Rashi. Shmuel, by contrast, chooses a very specific moment for Merav's death, which entwines it with the tragic subplot of Palti ben Laish. After laying the naked sword in their bed to ensure his forbearance, Palti takes in and fosters Merav's 5 orphan sons. Now Palti had to do as the king desired. Between Michal and himself, he laid a naked sword. Then Merav died, and he took her child and raised her 5 children with his own household. A brief aside, as you probably sense, there's quite a bit of textual corruption here. And I'm working from the Editio Princeps. In the manuscript tradition and in later printed editions, we have variations of this. But clearly, the printers of the Editio Princeps took this as a legitimate reading of whatever text they were working from. So we'll do the same here. There's no obvious reason then to link Merav's death with Michal's marriage to Palti, unless we take into account the future narrative payoff. The commitment to duty that characterizes all of Palti's actions is further augmented by his adoption of Michal's 5 orphaned nephews, whom he welcomes into his house, despite this being merely a sham marriage. It seems suggestive that while the rabbis consistently emphasize these sons were fostered by Michal, after whom they are then named in the scene of execution, Shmuel Buch insists that Merav died and so he took her child, and her 5 sons he raised. 1,000 verses later, the epic will show us how David hands these sons, whom we the reader now see as the children of both Michal and Palti, raised in the course of their many years together, to the Gibeonites to be gruesomely killed and their corpses defiled. One wonders whether Shmuel Buch, unequivocally convinced that Michal's childlessness is a punishment for her sin against David, also understands this last brutal, devastating episode to be the final stroke of that divine decree. Perhaps moved by the sheer horror of this moment, the narrator uncharacteristically breaks the 4th wall and addresses the reader, saying, "They died together, not one was left alive. May God have mercy on you and spare you such suffering as was there." Their bodies hang exposed to the elements until the rainy season. The bride lifted her veil and spoke her mind, surely without imagining it would cost her the sons she raised. Meanwhile, the descendants of David's dearer beloved, Jonathan, conveniently are spared this very fate. Palti, who bared a sword to serve his king and to preserve his own honor and that of the women and children in his care, keeps his life but nothing else. Perhaps biblical reticence was meant to contain those subterranean emotions too terrible to confront. And perhaps rabbinic explication, repeatedly sundering text from its subtext, from its context, preserves this mediation, whose function is both interpretive and protective. Shmuel Buch, meanwhile, seems in these final moments of Michal's story to falter in its commitment to subtextual fidelity. What had been the pleasure of the romance, the exhilaration of its violence, its eroticism, and its tragic pathos drains away. An abject prayer for God's mercy takes its place. Shmuel Buch may succeed in its faithful translation of subtext into text, but the naked sword cuts and the exposed body suffers. Thank you. I'm stopping my screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that beautiful paper. I'm sure there's going to be lots of comments and questions, but we are going to move now to Oren's talk. Dr. Oren Roman is a researcher of Yiddish literature in all periods and of the cultural history of Ashkenazic Jews in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. He received his PhD in 2015 from the Yiddish department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He was a visiting fellow at the University of Oxford and a postdoctoral fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and at Heinrich Heine University in Düsseldorf. He is currently a Kreitman postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics at Ben-Gurion University. And Oren will talk to us today about dislocation in translation in early Yiddish literature. Oren.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you very much. I'm also happy and I'm honored to have this stage, and I wish we could have met in person. And I do hope that this will happen soon. I was originally going to talk about anachronism in early modern Yiddish literature, but I found that the word dislocation suits me better because anachronism is only one kind of the phenomenon of dislocation. Anachronism dislocates things temporally, and it does not acknowledge the change that took place over years regarding objects or customs or even time-specific meaning of words. I found that there are also other kinds of dislocations, which I'll now describe, but just a small example of such a temporal dislocation is describing wars that took place in biblical times, but in which guns, for example, are used. Or when describing a biblical idolatry with terms of Christianity, like church or priest or a cross, that would create a temporal dislocation because these things did not exist back then. Other kinds of dislocations, which are, some kinds of anachronisms, I might, as I speak, I haven't prepared, I didn't write down what I'm going to say, so I might say anachronism and mean dislocation. So that's a heads up warning. Another kind of dislocation is geographical dislocation. For example, when Christian songs describe Jerusalem as a port city, okay, that's a geographical dislocation. That's not correct, but it doesn't have to do with anachronism proper. And there's also a cultural dislocation. For example, when liturgical dramas, for example, English mystery plays from the Middle Ages, portray Isaac as praying to the Trinity. We do have an anachronistic element in that, because one might argue that prayers to the Trinity did not exist in the time of Isaac, although Christian theologians might say that they did. But anyway, the cultural inaccuracy is also some kind of dislocation. Another aspect of dislocation is its context. Where do dislocations occur? I've found out that dislocations occur when retelling stories in the past. They can be, these stories can be realistic or fictional. They can involve many genres and styles and have various purposes. They can occur, these dislocations can occur in texts that wish to record history. They can occur in texts that are edifying religiously. They can occur in texts, in popular texts, such as fables or folk stories that wish to teach a lesson or warn people from certain things. They can occur in texts that mourn, and most often they occur in texts that seek to entertain their readership. In belles letters, epic literature, and the likes. So these are this is the what and the where. Now comes the question of why. Why do dislocations occur? The first explanation is an innocent dislocation. And a dislocation that occurs in a society that has, in a society or among people or a certain individual, the narrator or the author, who have a weak sense of history, of accuracy. That's one explanation. An example for that could be certain kinds of medieval paintings where European painters draw the landscape of the Bible, of the Holy Land, and they just portray their own landscape. That could be an innocent anachronism or dislocation, but as I'll say later, not necessarily. Another kind of dislocation can occur consciously by what one might call an abusive agenda that seeks to repress history or change it for one's own purposes. As I mentioned earlier, when portraying idolatry scenes in biblical times with Christian terms, that could be an abusive anachronism serving the Jewish party in the Jewish-Christian dispute. Another reason for dislocation is what I call simply convenience. For example, when telling epic poetry in the Balkans in the 20th century, researchers found out a few things. Have noticed that, you know, in the Balkans you have a mixed population of Christians and Muslims. And poets have told that have confessed to the researchers, I'm talking about Perry and Lord, that depending on the audience that they had in that evening, Christians or Muslims will win the battle that they depict. Okay, even if they're depicting a historical battle where it is known who won, it doesn't matter. They want to give their audience, their present audience, entertainment, and then they will let them win and repress history. I don't think that this kind of dislocation stems from an agenda per se, and it does not stem from historical unawareness. It just stems from convenience. A fourth kind of dislocation occurs from another kind of convenience, and that is that sometimes too much accuracy is be a burden. For example, clothing. If you want to portray a king, you might want, as a poet or author, you might want to let your audience know the king they're used to see. So you would say, for example, if I'm portraying a king in a Polynesian society, I might say, if I want to be accurate, he was wearing a necklace with very big seashells from a certain kind, which would identify him in Polynesian society as ruler, king. But for most people who are unaware of the customs of Polynesian society, that would not mean much. I would much rather just say that he had a golden crown on his head. Then everyone would know that this is the king. So that's another dislocation. Again, it's not born of historical unawareness. It's not born of an agenda. It's just more convenient for the bigger purpose of the narrative. And finally, there is a fifth reason why dislocations occur, and that is because they are inevitable. Not even the most learned historian can avoid them. Words change meaning over time, and when we retell the past, we always intrude into the text. Every author does that. That is unavoidable. And I wrote down that any presentation of the past in contemporary language will involve accommodations. So those are five reasons for dislocation. Let's see. Here's an example of how a word changes meaning over time in translation. When retelling the Bible, most of my talk will be within the prism of retelling biblical stories, but not only. When speaking about the children of Israel, even in modern in Hebrew, in contemporary Hebrew, when we speak about Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, it's obvious, at least for me, that we're talking about the biblical setting. The people who left Egypt and are wandering in the desert. Those are the children of Israel. And usually the traditional translation will be Kinder Israel, which is a exact translation, Bnei Kinder, children, Israel, Israel, the children of Israel. However, many times you will see in Yiddish works that retell that that same setting, retell biblical stories, that they will use the term die Yidden, the Jews, when referring to Kinder Israel. This shows that they see no distinction between Kinder Israel and Yidden, and that they would identify themselves with Yidden being the contemporary term for Jewish people with the children of Israel in the Bible. And that already involves or makes reference to the Christian-Jewish conflict in interpreting the Tanakh, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, by saying wherever it says the children of Israel, they mean us. Another example for such dislocations within Jewish context is this picture, where we see two biblical scenes, the circumcision of Isaac and the binding of Isaac, and the men are wearing medieval Jews' hats. Now, how can that be? Again, I mean, it's obvious that, is it? I mean, we need to question everything, but it appears that Patriarch Abraham did not wear a Jew's hat, a medieval European Jew's hat. Yet he's being portrayed as such. Now, why we have here Sarah Offenberg, professor of Jewish art, who could answer this question much better than me. But the fact that this is a dislocation, an anachronism, a cultural dislocation is obvious. Is it innocent anachronism? Is it abusive anachronism? Is it convenient anachronism? Is it inevitable anachronism? Let's see. But the fact that it is a dislocation is undisputable. Okay. I would now this was all a preface to my talk about Yiddish literature. Yiddish literature, Yiddish is a Jewish vernacular. It's a language that was spoken by Jews, circulated in a Jewish society, and it addressed Jews. As such, it reflects also issues of Jewish identity. I've already referred to the Jewish-Christian polemic or conflict in religion in general, and when dealing with the Tanakh, with the Bible, even more so, but not necessarily. The corpora I will refer to, the literary corpora I will refer to here, are epics that have reached us in Yiddish. And within the epic, the genre of epic, we have two main subgroups. One is epics that are based on European chivalric themes, and the other is epics that are based on the biblical text. And I'm using the word Old Yiddish to distinguish the language, to locate the language in time. We're talking about a little bit about the late Middle Ages and mostly about the early modern era. And that's the kind of Yiddish that circulated in those days. From a literary research point of view, if we want to be linguistically accurate, we would say Middle Yiddish, but when talking about literature, we just use simple Old Yiddish as opposed to the modern literature that started in the 19th century. Now, Old Yiddish epic that draws on European chivalric themes occupies a spectrum of almost not changing anything on the one side, on the one hand, to changing a lot and Judaizing the epic on the other. I have two examples that give us both ends of the spectrum. And Old Yiddish epic on biblical themes is a new Jewish creation that is based on the chivalric themes, the European chivalric style, but draws on a setting that is completely Jewish, and that is a Jewish creation. It is not. It has not been done in this way by non-Jews, whereas the chivalric themes have been retold also by Christian neighbors or co-territorial cultures that were present in the same territory where Yiddish existed. The first example would be Dukus Holland, found in, this text was found in Cairo, in the Geniza, in the famous Geniza, while mostly the Geniza holds small fragments. Here we found not only a text, one of the oldest literary texts in Yiddish, but it's also been preserved as a whole manuscript dated to 1382. And it has some various texts. I'd like to just speak about Dukus Holland, which occupies half of this manuscript. This is a text that speaks about German characters known from other German epics, and it has very few Jewish particular elements, so much that some people have named it, referred to it as German and Hebrew letters. Indeed, this is a Christian text. When a wedding is described, it takes place in a church. The time reference is Pfingsten, the Pentecost, Christian holiday of Pentecost. And it's obvious that these characters are not Jewish. It's been noticed that the word church for church appears twice in this manuscript, once as the regular German Kirch, and another time with a Jewish term Tifle. Now, Tifle has a pejorative meaning, but first of all, we see that neither term was used exclusively. So we see that the situation is not black and white. That's number one. Number two, I argue that even when you use the word tifle, it doesn't necessarily have to have a pejorative meaning. Even today, when many Israelis, even academics, speak about Jesus in Hebrew, they will call him Yeshu, and they will rarely think about the fact that this name has a pejorative meaning. And even if they're aware of that, they would not have to mean it. We have very few texts like Dukus Holland. This text actually has not been, this specific text has not survived elsewhere, not even among Germans, in the Latin letters. One of the reasons for that, we believe, is that because these texts were transmitted orally in recitals, where a poet would stand in front of an audience and just tell them the story by heart. He may have had a manuscript, and he may not have had a manuscript in front of him, but the main way to access these texts was through hearing. This teaches us that Jews were present in such recitals, and they knew them. We also don't know that there was even a distinction in the recitals between Jewish and Christian recitals. There probably were just recitals where anyone who wanted could participate, perhaps pay money, perhaps just physically be present. That in itself is proof that Jews had no problem in hearing the original Christian terms, Kirch, Pfingsten, and they knew what they meant. The few manuscripts that we have may or may not give us the broader picture, and may or may not be the preference of certain scribes. And scribes, by definition, belong to the Jewish elite and may be a little bit more pious or religious or anti-Christian than the readership of these epics. Another example from the other end of the spectrum is Bovo Dantona, a European chivalric narrative. It's known in English as Beavis of Hampton, and in Italian, Bovo Dantona. And we also have it in Yiddish, Bovo Dantona, printed first in Izny, 1541. If I'm not mistaken, it was composed in manuscript by Eliyahu Bachur in 1509 in Padua, also in northern Italy. And researcher Claudio Rosenzweig has identified the Bologna 1497 edition as his source. This is a Bovo Dantona of Eliyahu Bachur is a retelling of the story. He has taken artistic liberty to expand and concentrate various parts of the narrative. He did not translate it. And what interests me are his dislocations. Now, many people ask, was the Bovo in Yiddish Jewish or Christian? Because in the European retellings, in the Italian or the English, it's obvious that he's Christian. When he prays, when he marries, when he has children, every religious aspect of his life is Christian. And that's normal because these are stories that are told in a Christian society. Now, when Eliyahu Bachur translates into Yiddish, which is a Jewish vernacular, he blurs Bovo's identity. I think that the Jews, the Ashkenazic Jews who were his primary readership in northern Italy, later it circulated to all of Ashkenaz, but I think that for sure the Jews of northern Italy knew Bovo Dantona. He's been mentioned, he's been painted, he's been statues of him have appeared, and everyone knew that he's a knight, he's a Christian character. But we do see some Jewish aspects to Bovo, and that is, I think, because Eliyahu Bachur wanted to entertain his readership where it's possible. So, for example, when Bovo has children, in the original they're baptized, but in the Yiddish version they're circumcised. Not because he wants to abusively change the plot and make a European knight Jewish, but I think because he realized that if he speaks about baptism, his readership will not necessarily understand it and probably not enjoy it as much as they would when they hear about the circumcision. Does anyone here speak Italian? Could read this? Okay, so I'll just read the English translation. When he sees the children, this is a retelling, it's not an accurate translation. He then baptized them as Sinibaldo and Guidon, which was so perfect as Bovo said. That's the Italian version. In Yiddish, we see something else. Und noch brocht men ihr die Kind dar, sie sprach, sie sei noch nicht beschnitten. Der König sprach, du darfst nicht sorgen, ein hübschi Brismille will ich machen morgen. Der ander Tag kam noch, da ließ die jungen jüdischen Trogen. So they brought the children to her. This is when Bovo and his wife Tuziana reunite. The children are brought. She said, they have not been circumcised yet. The king said, don't worry, I will make tomorrow a nice bris mile, circumcision. The next day came, and they brought ceremoniously the children to be circumcised. My two last sources are retellings of the book of Joshua. This book, first retelling of the book of Joshua is found in a manuscript in Parma, in the Palatine Library in Parma, dated 1511. And we see here some kind of dislocation. When describing Jericho, now Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. I can't see it, yeah. No one could leave or enter. Okay. The retelling is quite accurate, but add some more detail. Nun was Jericho ein Stot, die was bewahrt also wohl. Well, Jericho was a city that was guarded so well. Sie het wohl 7 Mauern mit Harnisch war sie voll. She had 7 walls surrounding it, and it was full of harness, of shields. Maybe shields on the walls, maybe shields that people held. Und sonst, viel Wassergräben hatten sie es sich gemacht, vor Kinder Israel hatten sie es ausgebracht. And also, it had many water-filled moats, chafir, te'alot mayim. They made them, they dug them around the city because they were afraid of the Israelites, of the children of Israel. Okay, so how can Jericho, that lies in the desert, have many water-filled moats? That's a geographical dislocation, right? But the author wanted to portray a medieval city that is well guarded. I have to say that speaking about the 5th kind of dislocations, the inevitability, maybe I, by saying this, am sinning in dislocation because I'm judging Jericho according to its contemporary climate. Maybe 2,000 years ago, there was water around Jericho. Maybe Jericho was a city located elsewhere. I might be, even though I pretend or think that I'm a conscious historian, I might be mistaken and dislocating myself. Here is another text, another totally different rendition of the book of Joshua, printed in Krakow in 1594. And I've saved the best for last. We have here, 2 examples. This one, God tells them to surround the city for 6 days. And the Yiddish retelling says, retells what God said to Joshua, go around the city a whole day, blow the shofar, and then rest. Do that 6 days. But if you look here at the second stanza, because I think I'm a bit I have to finish, right? With Yiddish? How am I with time? Okay, so I'll just go quickly. Read the second stanza. Azot et Israel vi Yoshua his. Israel did that as Joshua ordered. Sie gingen die Stadt. They went around the city. Mit Bixen, Schwert, Spieß, with guns, swords, and spears. Now, how do guns come to the biblical war, to the biblical battlefield? What kind of anachronism is it? I argue that this is convenient anachronism because the audience, the readership, wanted to hear about a battle, a good battle. That was popular topic. That was a popular topic. That is the raison d'être, maybe, of this story, because we see that the stories of the first prophets, the former prophets, have been retold much in Yiddish, and these books are full of battle stories. So I argue that people just wanted to hear a good battle story that is good, that is full of detail, and that's why we have guns there. Did the authors not have any historical consciousness? I say they did have historical consciousness. We see that, we glean that from sayings such as here, der Oren war schon vor dem Volk als Pfleg zu sein. When describing how the children of Israel marched, they say that the Ark of the Covenant was placed in front of the people as it used to be, as was customary. Or in another place, when they describe how the Israelites celebrated Passover, they say, man as matzes iberal, as men tut auf die Tog heuten. They ate matzot everywhere as they still do today, as one still does today. There are many examples like this that show us that the authors of Yiddish epics did have a historical perspective. They did understand that times change and that what we have today is not necessarily what we had then. Now, the best and the last, we read about the circumcision scene in the desert. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and proceed with the second circumcision of the Israelites. So Joshua had flint knives made, and the Israelites were circumcised at Givat Ha'aralot, the hill of foreskins. Now I'm referring to Rachel's paper with the other kind of foreskins. First of all, we see flint knives, right? That's what they used in biblical times, not metal knives. So it's really different. Let's see how it's retold in Yiddish. Nun waren Israel viel. Israel was many. The Jews were many. Der Gevatter mussten man viel hon. You needed many kvaters, or many people to be circumcised. So for a circumcision, in the Ashkenazic circumcision, the man who either holds the baby when he's being circumcised or gives him over to the man who will hold him, that's the kvater. Man macht viel der Wachen. Many Wachnacht ceremonies were held. Wachnacht, again, the Ashkenazic ceremony that is done on the night preceding the Brit, the circumcision. As die Weiber pflegen zu tun. Today, as women used to do, as women do, sorry, this is present tense, as women do. Now today, the Wachnacht is usually when children, male children, come to the bed of the woman who gave birth and they say Shema or other verses from the Torah. It could be that men study Torah or Zohar, but here we see that it's a feminine ceremony, and I've managed to find that evidence that from other sources that women would wash the baby and throw coins into the water where the baby is washed as part of that ceremony. So that's already here in the Bible, in the retelling of the Bible. In der Schulen darf man sie nicht zutragen. You didn't have to carry them to the synagogue. Es wäre sie gewesen zu schwer. They would have been too heavy because we're talking about adult males that are being circumcised. Man beschnitt Volk Israel as Sand in Meer. The children of Israel were circumcised like sand on the sea. Der Moel waren viel. There are many Mohalim. Man macht Sgor kein Zocher. They did not do any Sholem Zocher, another Ashkenazic ceremony. Der Miles waren unzählt. The foreskins were endless, countless. Es as deroif kein Balbos noch kein Bocher. No one ate there. And no one ate in the celebration of the Brit Milah. Again, referring to the fact that circumcision ceremony in Ashkenaz meant that you get food. And now the narrator says, and it probably because it was unappealing, unappetizing to see so many cut foreskins. The narrator is now intruding the text and saying, had ich dorten gewesen, had I been there, ich hätte schier besser vor sie allen gegessen, ich hätte es nicht kennen müssen. If I were there, I would eat so much, more than I can tell. Wow. Okay, now, so I started with the painting of the Isaac's circumcision, where the Jews have Jewish hats, and now I've ended with this text where a biblical circumcision is portrayed as an Ashkenazic circumcision ceremony. And I would just like to say that we saw that there are many dislocations, anachronism, geographical dislocation, cultural dislocation in Jewish literature in the early modern era. It does not stem from naiveness or unawareness, but rather it stems from one, an abusive or conscious anachronism where the authors want to give authority to Jewish customs from the Bible and to take a stand in the Jewish-Christian polemic. That's number one. And to say, we are doing like they did. We are like Father Abraham. We are like Isaac. We're like Jacob. We're like the children of Israel. That's number one. And number two, because of convenience. Many epics sought to entertain their readership by giving them battle descriptions, telling them about war. That was a very popular topic. So when you describe a war, regardless where and when, you want to give juicy descriptions. People knew, or most people, at least the authors knew, that there weren't any guns or gunpowder or cannons in biblical times, but they knew that contemporary war descriptions had those in them, and they didn't want to offer a lesser version, not a good a version as the others do. So they have included that. And I forgot to say, but also in the Balkans, in Balkan epic, such phenomenon of guns being used in ancient battles has also been recorded. So that's not a Jewish invention in this aspect. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Oren. Could you stop sharing, and then we can,
yes.
I can see everyone and take questions. Okay, thank you, Oren. I'm going to open this for discussion. I'm sure there's many questions. I think I can see everyone, so you can just raise your hand if you'd like to ask. Maybe I'll start with the question to both of you, to both Rachel and Oren. I'm wondering about the role of, on the one hand, the target audience in these decisions and in these adaptations and decisions regarding what to emphasize and what not. What is the role of the target audience, and what is the role of genre? So that's my first question to both of you. And to Oren, just about Tifle in Lucas Horant. I'm interested in your point that it doesn't have to be an abusive, what you called an abusive dislocation or pejorative term. Yes. I think in the case of Lucas Horant, we are clearly talking about a transliteration. So it's very clear that this is a German text in which the word Kirche or Kirche appeared. So there was conscious choice made here to change that word. Whereas in other places we can assume that there wasn't, and this occurs in many other Yiddish texts, right? You know this better than anyone. I mean, we have many cases of Jewish adaptation or Yiddish transliterations of German texts in which the only word to actually change is the word Kirche or the word Christ into a pejorative term. So this is kind of a very active kind of transformation. So I have to wonder how naive can it actually be? And I think maybe the solution is that these 5 categories that you have, and I agree that, historical naivete is not one that we should even consider, but perhaps they're not that distinct. Perhaps this kind of tidy categorization of reasons for dislocation and reasons for deviation of the text is kind of getting in the way of understanding what's actually happening here. And there could be certain places where the change just is kind of all of them. It's convenience, it's abusive, it's and so
on. I agree. It's not natural sciences. The categories aren't clear cut, and there can be overlap. There are overlapping, and it's a lot of interpretation. I just wanted to give the other an extreme reading to show that it's not necessarily clear cut. But you're right that we can see Of course, we can see anti-Christian voices in the Yiddish text, for sure. I just wanted to show that not necessarily and not always. I think that many times the Judaizing element in German transcriptions, so-called transcriptions of Jewish texts, are neutralizing, not using a pejorative, but saying instead of Maria, Mary, and Jesus, just saying Gott, so that there's no pejorative element. Just say, you know, just making it softer and easier to swallow for the Jewish readership. As I said, I'm sure that they've also heard the originals, and they were okay. At least some of them were okay with that. The point is, we have very few texts, and the texts are written by one individual, and this individual, most scribes have had rabbinic education. So we need to take that into consideration when we deal with that. When we analyze these texts, there's also a difference between spoken and written texts. I've noticed, I'm interested in the actual singing performance of texts, and I've noticed that many songs employ, for example, instead of where you have a short line of a song with tonic syllabic meter, where every syllable counts and is limited, the number of syllables per line is limited, you have a word like got, which is one syllable. But when it's written down, they would write HaKodesh Baruch Hu, because it's one word, Hey Kuf Bet Hey, or Got Yisborach, because it's nicer to write it this way. It's more respectful to God, but it doesn't mean that it was pronounced this way. And this is just one example to show how the written texts are not identical to the texts that were said. So, bearing that in mind, you might also say that anti-Christian written terms are not necessarily the way these texts circulated orally. You might, I mean, it's not proof, but it's, you know, it's food for thought. Yeah, and maybe I'll let Rachel.
Yeah, I just wanted to return briefly to this question of kind of target audience. And I mentioned briefly in my talk this idea of the use that the reader is going to put the text to. And so on the one hand, in the case of something like Schwulbuch, we see really clearly in the paratexts that this is intended for entertainment purposes, right? The paratexts kind of on the title pages advertise these works as fun to read. But also some of those paratexts in some later editions described as being specifically for women and girls, which is common in Yiddish texts of this period. At the same time, some of the manuscripts we know were commissioned also by women. So there's a strong sense that you're dealing at least with a mixed reading audience. It's not just a learned kind of male elite. It's a wider audience, and that pleasure reading is a big part of this. We can also look at some other kind of features of the organization of the text. And this gives us some clues beyond what the printer wants us to believe the text is for. It gives us some implicit information about reading practices. So for example, there is no way to navigate within Schwulbuch. There's no way to find your place if you get lost. You have to put in your own bookmark. So unlike the rabbinic texts that I was referring to earlier, who are very concerned with finding particular kinds of information, right? And extracting that information from their kind of repository, Schwulbuch is not accessible this way. When I repeat linear and linearity over and over again in the course of my talk, this is what I'm referring to. It's a book that's meant to be read, that's meant for continuous reading, and it's designed this way. At the same time, we can see, based on kind of its variegate rabbinic composition and its, I think, pretty sophisticated interpolation of materials, that that's not how it was written, right? It's not a work that was written linearly, as in this kind of oral performance style. It was very, very carefully kind of composed. It's not to say it didn't stem from oral sources, but that when we get into the printed editions, we see printers really, really carefully manipulating and layering rabbinic and biblical texts. So, I mean, I would actually, and I should talk more about whether in this transition from orality into text, we see a whole range of like textual practices begin to take over. Part of what I am able to show is that between the editio princeps and later editions, we get really, really strong editorial intervention along this line, also wanting to clarify the distinction between rabbinic information and biblical literalism. So it's possible to look at kind of the construction of the book itself and see something of how it was meant to be read and how we were meant to experience these emotional arcs as kind of like powerful surges that carry through the whole text and can't be broken up into smaller pieces. No chapter headings, no verse numbers.
I'd like to add to this that in some epics, very few, one of them is an epic on Judges and the other, I think, on Ezekiel. We have, in two passages, we have paratext saying this is the haftarah for, and then in Shoftim, in Judges, it's for Beshalach, the Song of Deborah, and in Ezekiel, I think it's for the 7th day of Passover. And that's very interesting because that hints, and in Judges, we're talking about a manuscript, Ezekiel is a print, but this gives room for the possibility that it was read at least on a certain time of the yearly cycle of the year, and also perhaps some liturgical function, some function within religious life. I don't want to say in the synagogue because I don't know, but has some relationship to Jewish liturgy, religious proper liturgy, which is very interesting. And maybe after these works were printed and became, as Rachel says, survive, I wouldn't say meant for linear reading, but survived through linear reading, then, I mean, that's what we have later. We don't know how it started. And these two give us some idea to a previous use.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Magdalena.
Thank you very much both for wonderful, wonderful papers. My question is actually, I think, mostly to Oren. So how I'm reading your paper, and it is a kind of a follow-up of what we are here discussing. It's the role of the author at the center of producing a text, who is just like not naively, as you said, jotting the ideas, but he has like a conscious idea of a readership, and based on these different translocations and so on, we can guess what was the readership and so on. So my first question to both of you actually is, like, does it mean that we also do not have that many information about the use of these writings, part of, like readership marks and so on? And my second question, more specific to Oren, is so all these dislocations, they seem to be, if you do this type of adaptations, it means that you can somehow localize the text, put it into distinct location, signifying certain limit of the text that will need to be adapted again in order to be translocated into another location. But on the other hand, like most of the examples that you have shown are pretty general, it seemed to me that they would be understandable to like an educated contemporary Yiddish reader. So it doesn't mean, it doesn't matter whether you live in Italy or somewhere in Central Europe in order to have a concept that, oh, people go with guns to a war and so on. So I actually wonder, like, so are these translocation signs of a geographical limit, or actually do they actually show that the author himself thinks about the audience in far more broader terms than immediate readership around him? Thank you.
Do you want to go first, Rachel?
No, you go for it.
It's a good question. I ask it myself a lot. To the best of my knowledge, there are few readers' marks on the manuscripts or books, except for what I've just said. from the listing in Italy in the 16th century, we know that this genre was very popular. There are, I think, I don't remember the number, I think in Mantova, for those of you who don't know, in Mantova, in Italy, in I think 16th century, there was the purging of Jewish libraries, and all Jews had to report what kind of books they had at home for the church to allow or not allow them to keep them. These books mostly did not survive, but some of the lists did, and we know what books Jews had at home. And you see from a certain number of books, I don't remember the exact number, I'd say a few hundreds, there were 16 Judges epics, 16 Yiddish epics about the book of Judges in Mantua, in the Jewish community of Mantua. Today, only one book survived. I mean, two, if you consider the two extant versions. But anyway, only in Mantua there were 16. So we know that it was very popular. That's number one. Regarding the dislocations, many people consider the epics in Yiddish as the Bible epics as a Jewish version of the general epic that was very popular at the time, when Jews wanted to show that they also have their own national heroes with whom they can identify completely, because Bovo or Hildebrand, they're Christian, or Dietrich von Bern, they're Christian. You know, they go to church. There's also the memory of the Crusades. Jews could not fully identify with them, whereas Abraham or David or Samson are, you know, much easier to identify with. I think that this theory is a bit simplistic, right? It's not black and white, because we do see that Jews were integrated into the general society, integrated or open to neighboring cultures, and they did like those heroes as well. But when you bear in mind that the biblical epics were written with the model of the European, specifically German epic, in terms of language, in terms of register, in terms of epithets, in terms of melody, then you see that that's the muster, that's the pattern that they adhered to, the authors. So the dislocations have been imported from the Christian epics. So Dietrich von Bern could use guns because he was more contemporary. He was also, you know, if you look at the historic character of Dietrich, he existed before there were guns. But okay, other European novels used guns. So when creating a quote-unquote Jewish version, you would want the Jewish knights to be as good as the Christian knights.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually, also, that this idea of the national hero assumed in this period very, very specific contours, right? And definitely throughout the biblical epics, you have a much finer grained attempt to reconstruct that literary type than merely kind of, we want an epic of our own. So, you know, one example of this in the biblical epics is that you have feudal titles like Herzog, like imported into the text. There's really an effort to superimpose wholesale a kind of cultural context on the biblical text, as though to make it interpretable as a translation would, as a kind of social and cultural translation. And it's not an argument for, oh, Herzog is translating this word in the biblical text. Obviously, that's something that is very, very consciously imposed on the past as a way, not I think of arguing that that was exactly the structure of feudal kind of political organization in biblical Israel, but is as a way of kind of coding for political power, right? So the construction of the national hero and the kind of cultural needs that's serving is actually very, very specific and shows a lot of care and attention.
Any further questions? Yes, Yaakov, and then Osnet.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Beautiful presentation and wonderful case study. You stressed the exegetical layer of stressing emotions, the emotional aspect of the story, of the biblical story, and I wondered where does it stand in the, first of all, in the field of the history of emotions, and where did it come in late medieval or early Renaissance history of emotion? This is the first question, which I guess you'll have something to say, and I am really interested in this point of view. And the other aspect is whether it have any connection to any theatrical adaptations. Were these translations adapted to the theater, to kind of it's not really Punspiel, but maybe some kind of Schmuelspiel or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the history of emotions, this is really another avenue that I need to explore. So I'm not going to be able to give you some kind of good comparative work in that department. But it does seem to me that Schmuelbuch is very clearly borrowing from narrative arcs. While I don't want to maybe go into making the emotional reaction that a contemporary audience has to these texts analogous to that of the historical audience, it seems to me that if we look at narrative pacing and patterning, we see Schmuelbuch making use of patterns that are already at work in chivalric romances / epics of the same period. And especially if you think about for example, the bride quest narratives in the Germanic epics, you've got exactly this kind of dynamic playing out across the Michal story, but using this biblical material as a basis and relying on Midrash to kind of amp up the various chapters of this story and to flesh them out. So I do think that we can look from a structural perspective at the generation of certain kinds of rise and fall without going too dramatically into the emotional nuance. In terms of performance, we have no evidence of this. Actually, our evidence of kind of early Yiddish drama comes relatively late, which makes sense. It's exactly what Oren was saying before, that the oral performance of these texts, vastly antedated any of our surviving texts. And while we do have certainly Purim as an occasion in which many different biblical stories were performed already in like the late 17th century, these particular epic iterations where you don't have many performers and you have a single voice kind of proclaiming the text seems to have been the norm then. I don't know, Oren, do you have a sense of whether this transition, whether the epics in any way, so the standard narrative right now, the historiographic narrative, is that the epics kind of die out and are replaced by other genres. And among those genres, we then get the rise of kind of biblical drama in Yiddish. I don't know, do you feel like there's a bridging, like transition moment there, or do you accept this kind of extinction model?
It's a good question why this genre collapsed and disappeared. We see that the Tzene rises at about that time. We're talking about 17th century. So I can't show positive evidence that Tzene replaced biblical epic, but they both retell, in the vast form. The biblical epic does retell the Tanakh, and the Tzene gives homiletics on the weekly portion. So it's not the same, but it does, offer the Tanakh to a Yiddish-speaking readership. And the role of gender could be investigated or looked into in both cases. I know that some Purim Spiel have scenes that are addressed by biblical epic, like the binding of Isaac. There's evidence that David's war with Goliath was also a play, but just a scene, not the whole epic, like literally epic, David's life till death, which exceeds even Samuel and goes a bit into the Book of Kings. That's unique for Schmuelbuch, but certain epics were performed also dramatically. We have even I think until the 20th century. So Akedat Yitzchak, for example, was recorded in Poland, in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. So.
The other thing that occurs to me is that definitely what we do see in the Purim-Spiel and its construction, its layering of exegetical materials has a lot in common with the kinds of operations I've sketched out in Shmuel Buch, and often to the same sorts of effect, or at least in the same provocative form, right? So even if we don't want to describe exactly what emotions these are eliciting, in the case of the Purim-Spiel, we definitely see Midrash introduced to kind of amplify shock value or comic value. It's clearly designed, injected to kind of amp up the effect of the narrative on the audience. At least the work that I've done on Purim-Spiel, it seems to me that there's a lot of use of the dialogic quality of rabbinic texts, that the multitude of voices in rabbinic texts that compete kind of for stage time is definitely something you see play out to comic effect in the Purim-Spiel when it incorporates Midrash. So I think there are exegetical practices that get kind of carried forward across genres, even if it doesn't mean the adaptation of a specific epic into a specific staging.
Nat?
Do we still have time? Are we put the time? Okay, thanks. So I kind of have a question for each of you. First of all, thank you very much. Very fascinating and beautiful. So for Oren, I was wondering to kind of continue a line of questioning that Yiddish started. It does seem to me that in most cases, dislocation would fit into several of the categories that you outlined. And I was wondering if there are places where I think this categorization would be very useful if you found a place, a text, a genre, a writer where it is very specific, where really one of these different motivations really stands out in a way that's instructive in understanding this genre or work or writer. And for Rachel, I have a question. I hope I can get it across. I hope it's not too crude, but you spoke of the Fidelity, the faithful translation. And I was wondering, I mean, I think many translations strive to be faithful in their own way. And I was wondering if, just for the sake of argument, you have any theoretical lines in the sand that you would draw between a faithful and non-faithful translation, just so we can kind of refine the use of the term of fidelity of a translation.
Sure.
Thanks.
Oren, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think that the dislocations show two main raison d'etre. One is to provide entertainment and descriptions of battles, good descriptions of battles, and the other one is to provide the readership models with whom they can identify, from whom they can get authority and an example how to behave. So if the children of Israel perform this circumcision like we do, then we're on the right path, no matter what the Christians say. If the children of Israel ate matzot just like we do, we're okay, like we're safe. That and just good entertainment in general, I think, would explain most dislocations. Of course, not every case. It's not a chemistry book with formulas, but bigadol.
In terms of fidelity as a heuristic device, no. I mean, largely this is I introduced Bialik, kind of as this poor straw man in the beginning of the talk, and clearly fidelity is an idea there to play with, more than to kind of structure my deep reading of the text. It seems obvious to me that, to pose myself an even cruder version of this question, isn't this just kind of the letter versus the spirit all over again, right? And it seems to me that one of the things that I wanted to do was to point at the way that actually subtextual fidelity is not merely appealing to the spirit of the text, but that Shmuel Buch, I think what I'm trying to aim at is the idea that Shmuel Buch sees the biblical corpus as this expanded thing, right, as a dual Torah, and that because of this expansion, we can't start applying kind of clear standards of translation to this expanded corpus, right? The line becomes completely blurred. There's no way to talk about the letter versus the spirit when you're talking about this kind of expanded canonical universe from which materials can be drawn and reorganized as a given author sees fit in a particular time and place. So part of what I wanted to do was to play with this whole idea of fidelity and kind of open it up / let it go. At the same time, I think it is really what my work with in a kind of more textual critical capacity with later editions shows me is that if these translations, adaptations of biblical narrative saw themselves as doing something radical or wild, they would not be working so hard to revise earlier editions' uses of biblical and midrashic materials. We see kind of obsessive revision to get more and more precisely right some exegetical stance that's only implicit in the text, and that I think most readers, certainly pleasure readers, are just going to zoom by. So part of what I wanted to point at was the idea that Shmuel Buch's producers took seriously their responsibility to their source materials, which is something that's not obvious when you're reading for pleasure, but then when you look at their textual operations, comes to the fore. Yeah.
Okay, thank you both so much, and thanks everyone else for a very interesting discussion. This has been great, and I hope to see you all soon. We have Lior Jacobi will be presenting next in our Do Text seminar, which will be the last seminar for this academic year. So please visit our website to stay up to date with what's going on in the project. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.